Hi, sweeties. How are you doing? Welcome to Naya Sim, and thank you all so much for all the love and support. Hope you all are doing amazingly great. So today we'll be talking something very important, and it's about a video that I ran across about slave breeding plantations, where they were like trying to explain that it was one of the most profitable in America. They have really been showing us a lot of plantations, cotton, this, that, but they never or they don't talk a lot about breeding plantation, how they started breeding. And this is one of the most profitable ever. And looking at all this, you see one of the reasons why they do not want African American history to be taught, right? They do not want it to talk about African American history, Black history, how we started and how we ended and all that. But did slavery ever ended? Not at all. It still just evolved and all that. And that is why all of a sudden they jumped out to tell us that slavery was beneficial to the slaves, right? And this is something that they are trying to hide. They do not want to break their hearts. They do not want to, feel like they are the bad people or they were the ones that, did all the horrible things. And that was why they turned around to tell us slavery was beneficial to slaves. You know what? Let's get into this breeding plantation and talk about it.
That I'm writing an album called The Middle Passage. They've shown us every plantation with cotton on it. You know what plantation they've never shown us, Abby? The most prominent ones. The ones that were most profitable. The breeding plantations. Why don't you want to show us those? You know why? Because after the research that I did for this album, you realize that the moment that a girl menstruated, she was put in a stable where a horse would be and forcibly mated, forcibly raped by a male of the slave master's choice. And when she had children, they weren't called children, they were called a litter of pups. The punishment for raping or killing a person in medieval Spain is gelding. Gelding is when you take hot pincers and you take a man's balls and dick off root and stem. Killing a person, law of the Bible, right? Medieval Spain, super religious. You killed a man, he should be killed. Why were indigenous and black people categorized as subhuman? So under the law, you would not be punished for the things that you did to us. That's why. You used to be proud, right? Used to be proud, white America, of rape and murder. Used to be proud of colonization. Used to, wow, that made us tough. And then you got ashamed of it. And that's what you're dealing with. That's what America's dealing with, a schizophrenic crisis. There's a British manual, right, that was taken out of the British Museum because within the manual, it talked about how rape was a weapon of war that should be used against the indigenous population. You're ashamed of that now. You're ashamed, right? Who was Christopher Columbus? His image has been so whitewashed, but he was trafficking little girls on an island. Who does that sound like, huh? All you right-wing defenders of Christopher Columbus and his legacy, he was trafficking 9-year-old indigenous girls on an island. Who does that remind you of, you intellectual coward? Just because liberals are dog shit doesn't mean that you shake hands with the devil. You realize that the moment that a girl menstruated, she was put in a stable where a horse would be and forcibly mated.
It's not quite Black History Month yet, but let's talk about a book I just sort of stopped reading 3/4 of the way through because it just made me so fucking sad. That book is The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Now, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh is a book that talks about the value of enslaved people quite literally and figuratively. It talks about their soul value, meaning the value or rather the ways in which enslaved people held value for themselves, but it also quite gives you the monetary value of an enslaved person depending on gender, age, what they did, etc. A thing that is mentioned in this book is the difficulty that enslaved parents had knowing that their children would typically be sold off during adolescence, and the thing they were trying to do is figure out ways to secure their own money so that they could buy back their own children. Because how do you teach a child that they're going to be a slave? There is specifically a portion of the chapter on adolescence called menstruation. Something you probably never put an actual thought to is that if you own a human being, if you are someone who enslaves others, then what they produce, like the children that the enslaved produce, is also technically your property. So enslavers cared a lot about reproductive health, not in a good way, but things like this, right? This listing for a slave. She has a black complexion and was superior house servant, good seamstress, and a fair cook, washer, ironer, and hairdresser. Her menses are irregular but otherwise fully guaranteed. Stress can affect the menstrual cycle, and there is perhaps no greater stress than being enslaved. But obviously, people, that wasn't really their value at the time. Next portion of this chapter is specifically about RAPE and forced breeding. The transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808, and as you know, slavery went on for about another 50 or so years, a little over, which meant that a lot more so than before, enslaved people began to be valued on their ability to breed, both men and women. The average appraised value of like an adolescent enslaved person would be around $16,000. In today's money, that is. And but if you were at like a breeding prime, that value could go up to like 25,000 to 30K. Reflecting on her shift to adulthood, Harriet Jacobs described puberty as a sad epoch in the life of a slave girl. For her and many others, it marked the beginning of a period where all men could sexually assault them. Men were selected specifically for, quote, raising up strong black bucks, quote. They were sometimes taken on a circuit to visit other plantations and impregnate the women. After all, he noted, this was thrifty and saved any actual purchase of new stock. Willie McCullough of North Carolina described breeding. Some of the slave women were looked upon by the slave owners as a stock raiser looks upon his brood sows. That is, from the standpoint of production. If a slave woman had children fast, she was considered very valuable because slaves were valuable property. And a lot of the sexual abuse of enslaved men and women wasn't entirely for the purpose of stock. Sometimes it was just for the pleasure of their owners. Sam and Louisa Everett of Virginia recalled orgies on their plantation where their enslavers forced them to have sexual relations even though they had other partners. Their enslavers made Sam expose his genitals and asked Louisa, "Do you think you can stand this big?" When she hid her face from his nakedness, her enslaver forced her to look at Sam. Next, he told us that we must get busy and do it in his presence, and we had to do it. Henry Bibb, who successfully escaped slavery, summarized such practices. Every slaveholder who is the keeper of a number of slaves of both sexes is also the keeper of a house or houses of ill fame. He viewed the white man as licentious because they broke up the bonds of affection among enslaved families. But while the mortal technique wasn't necessarily correct on the part of, as soon as they get their menstruation, they were put into like stables. As soon as they did begin to menstruate, they would have their bodies violated by the gynecologist of that era in order to sort of appraise them for what value they could have as breeders. Around the age of 15 is when that sort of sexual violation of bodies would begin on black women and young black boys as well. There are many instances of that book of describing young enslaved women who would be assaulted as soon as they were purchased from the auction block, many of whom chose to end their own lives rather than to continue going through that. So the description of young boys being made to sort of run around naked on the stage and allowing the people at the auction houses to sort of poke and prod their muscles and ask them questions. All in all, with the end of the transatlantic slave trade came this new sort of era of hell of just breeding humans like livestock.
That I'm writing an album called The Middle Passage. They've shown us every plantation.
It's not a big deal, dude. I mean, it's not a big deal. It really isn't. The only reason why this type of things is so unacceptable is because we live in a gynocentric society where women are looked at as the highest prize, and in reality they're not. They don't do nothing for the society. They really don't. 2/3 of pretty much all women from Iceland didn't go to work, and the economy was fine. Nothing happened to it. That's really what they were for throughout history, even now. Except that they're not having kids anymore, so they're not useful.
The same way I tell people all the time who are white working class people who hear about reparations.
The nation of African American was not enslaved.
Most profitable, the breeding plantations. Why don't you?
Because then we would have to have the broader conversation about how slavery was the first, largest, and longest human trafficking slash sex trafficking ring in the world, which funded this great country we know as America today. All of America was equivalent to Epstein Island. Matter of fact, I believe the shit never stopped. They just moved it to secluded islands like Epstein Island and other shit like that. Allegedly, hypothetically, the government is in on it. That would explain the politicians and the presidents and the other government officials that are rumored to be on this list, allegedly. And everybody was okay as long as they got their free labor and got to make their money. The American dream, the American way. This is BPB. If you're not my kind, you can stay, but sit in the back and hush. And we will also have to put in perspective how sick these people were. As soon as a girl was old enough to have her period, they started breeding her. That can be as early as 9 years old, bro. 10 in my case. Get out of my business. But I'm just saying. And they weren't breeding these little girls with other little boys. They were doing it with grown ass who they felt like were strong and could make, good offspring. Grown men. Themselves in some cases. That explains all of the light-skinned babies that start popping up. I ain't trying to get into all that. Instead of capturing us, once they done got enough of us over here, they was like, let's start breeding them ourselves. Like, let's make a whole operation of this. Because I had read somewhere that the average life expectancy for a slave once they made it to America was probably about 10 years because of all the disease and just the conditions that they were under and everything like that. So I feel like in they sick minds, they thinking like if they're born and bred here, then like, it'll be better. They'll be stronger. The life expectancy will be longer. Some sick shit like that, I'm not one of them, so I can't begin to wrap my mind around some shit like that. But, But they literally bred us like animals, which to us we legally were, because for at least 400 years in this country, we weren't even considered full human beings. Like, I think it was like 1/3. Don't quote me. But it was like a law to where like we were only considered like 1/3 of a human. I ain't even make up a whole person. Like, what's really sick is the fact that for hundreds of years, thousands of little black girls were robbed of their innocence raped with the intent of impregnation, so that they can make more offsprings to be slaves. And if they're little girls, to happen and repeat this. That shit is traumatizing to think about. Like, they went through it. And to me, that speaks to the uncomfortable over-sexualization of black girls that start really young. Like, we all have a story. And society claim they don't like it and speak down on girls that sell sex or whatever. But those are the only ones y'all buy into. That's why that's the only mainstream representation we really have. There's plenty of beautiful, talented black women out here that's not talking about that. But y'all don't pay them no mind. Black girls literally come in all forms. Black women. But I say it all the time, no matter how great, successful, beautiful, educated, whatever you are, you always will be diminished and downplayed unless you talking about your coochie or shaking some ass. Or you will be reduced to just that. Rest in peace to Dr. Bonnie Antoinette Candia Bailey. She was a beautiful, black, intelligent, educated, established woman in her field. A doctor. Yet she was still broken down to the point she lost her will to live and bear the fruit of her labor. Like, all that hard work for what? For that, like, for real? To still not be seen, heard, or valued. Like, To this day, thousands of black girls go missing and nobody bats an eye. We was going missing way before there was ever an Amber Alert. But they did all that for one of them to the thousands of us that it's been happening to. And that's not to diminish or disregard anybody else's experience. I don't have to do that in order to make my point. But I'm just saying, like, that's how they act when it comes to one of them in comparison to thousands of us. Imagine being treated like that. Imagine generations of that, and then they turn around and call us promiscuous and fast. They try to downplay slavery, but to this day, we're still plagued by the diseases and generational curses that it caused on our people. From the cancer to the heart disease to the depression to the anxiety to, like, I can go on and on. And then on top of 400 some years of slavery, another 100 years of discrimination, blatant disrespect, and segregation. Like, not to mention the indiscretions that we face to this day, like. But just like a good liar, they gonna give us bits and pieces of the truth so they can control the narrative in a way. But the information is out there, and knowledge is power. Y'all be blessed.
So this is all I got from the stitches, and sincerely speaking, like she said, they downplay slavery so much. And the reality is that there are so many things they always do not want to show out, especially this breed. I am sure a lot of people know about breeding plantation. I got to know about it when I started talking about the massacre, excuse me, when I went into slavery, like, to find out more about slavery and all that. That was when I found out that there was breeding plantation where as soon as a young girl starts seeing her period, she is being put there. And that was actually when they found out, like, how do we travel, like, because according to the history, they moved down to Africa to get people, ship them, like, back to wherever they are going to and all that. When they found out that it takes a whole lot of time for them to execute all that, so they were like, okay, how do we make this thing? Like, we really have to do something. And then they started breeding plantation, and this is just something like, I don't want to wrap my head around, because this breeding plantation, I don't know, but sometimes I feel like that was one of the most horrible. I didn't know slavery was very horrible. Breeding plantation was very horrible, but I don't understand. You probably don't know the trauma the people that were going through that went through. And knowing the fact that while they were breeding, do not be surprised that a lot of siblings or a lot of relations ended up breeding together and all that. So why like the young man said, that they don't talk about that breeding plantation enough? I know you already know that they are running away from the real thing. Like, they do not want people to know a whole lot of things that happen. But one good thing I love about African American history is that it was well documented, that even when you type it on Google and you find whatever answer you are looking for, right? And that is just something I love about it. So because all these were the things that people went through, and all of a sudden they started telling us that slavery benefited slaves, right? And the fact that somebody, the palm-colored man that spoke in between, that said that it is not a big deal. You see how they gaslight themselves all the time, when we talk about slavery, when we talk about African American history, all they want to do is to tell you that it's been long time ago. Get over it. I mean, you were not even I tell you that you were not even the one that experienced it. And why are you talking about it? The reality is that slavery never ended. It evolved until, I mean, they showed us so much about cotton plantation, but they are all refusing to show us more about breeding plantation. So I am happy that all these conversations are coming out, and people are also, people like me, because there were people that really knew nothing, knew more. We never knew a lot about history, not until we started diving in to understand. But I am sure that most of you already know all this. But man, you see all these are the things that we all need to keep bringing up to the light, because they really do not want us to talk about our history anymore, because it violates them according to them, or it makes them fragile, or it breaks their heart, or it makes them feel like they are bad people and all that. No, these are the reasons why they do not want to teach it, and that's why they say African American history is violent, right? Because they want to hold, like they want to hide everything that happened. But you all can see that it can never happen, you know. And the more we keep spreading the news among ourselves, even when they decide that it cannot be taught in school anymore, according to them, because it is not good enough, it is violent. People's history is violent. And these are the people that were the savages. You know what? Thank you all so much for all the love and support. See you all in my next video. Bye for now.